The corporate office was a monument to success, gleaming glass windows, polished marble floors, and a faint, sterile scent of coffee and air conditioning that seemed to cling to everything. In the mornings, before the employees arrived, the building was a quiet fortress, all the noise and chaos of the day still to come. It was in these early hours that Jada worked. Alone, the only sound was the steady rhythm of her mop sweeping against the floor, echoing through the otherwise empty halls. Jada had learned to blend in here. She wasn't just the cleaner, she was the invisible worker, a fixture in the background that no one noticed. It was a strange, unspoken rule in the office: if you didn't stand out, you were safe. And for a woman like Jada, black, lower class, and with a job that was dismissed as unimportant, safety meant silence. Her daily routine was one of quiet invisibility. She cleaned up after meetings, wiped down glass surfaces that were constantly smudged with fingerprints, and emptied the overflowing trash bins. No one paid her any attention, and Jada had long since learned to keep her head down, to avoid making eye contact with the executives as they hurried past, so busy with their lives of power and privilege. She was just a cleaner. That was all she was supposed to be. But even in her silence, Jada observed everything. She had always been the quiet one, the one who saw things others didn't. And over the years, she'd started to notice certain patterns in the office, things that seemed out of place. Executives would leave hurriedly, their faces pinched with stress. Meetings would begin and end without anyone actually talking about anything substantial. Jada had never been one for politics or corporate strategies. She'd never had the luxury to indulge in the intricacies of office politics. She worked because she needed the money, because it was all she knew. But as she wiped down the conference room table one afternoon, she overheard something that stopped her in her tracks. She had just finished cleaning the main office and was about to leave for the break room when she heard voices coming from behind the closed doors of the boardroom. It was a small crack in the door, but it was enough to hear the conversation inside. "I don't care what the numbers say," one voice hissed. "We can't keep hiding this forever. The investors are going to want answers." Jada froze. She recognized the voice. It was Sarah, one of the senior executives. Her tone was sharp, urgent, but also tinged with fear. "You're worrying over nothing," another voice replied, this one cooler, more dismissive. "As long as the reports look good, no one will notice. It's all smoke and mirrors, Sarah. You've been in this game long enough to know that." The voice belonged to Michael Anderson, the CEO. Jada had seen him countless times, always impeccably dressed in his tailored suits, his face confident, commanding. He was a man who had never once spared a glance for the cleaners who worked beneath him. But now, hearing him speak, Jada couldn't shake the chill that ran down her spine. "They'll notice soon enough," Sarah countered. "I'm telling you, the numbers aren't adding up. The money's not where it's supposed to be." "Enough," Michael snapped. "This is our last quarter to make up for the losses. If we can just push through, we'll be fine. Just keep the facade up for a little longer." The conversation continued, but Jada could hardly hear it anymore. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and her mind was racing. What were they talking about? What numbers weren't adding up? She had always assumed that the company was just another well-oiled machine, but now something felt off. Jada knew how the world worked. She had been around long enough to understand that the rich and powerful often hid their flaws behind a facade of wealth and success. But this was different. This was something darker, something far more insidious. What could a company like this be hiding? And more importantly, what would happen if someone found out? Jada wasn't stupid. She'd seen the reports. She'd seen the figures in the accounting books that didn't make sense. She had quietly cleaned up the aftermath of meetings where numbers were discussed, numbers that seemed to have no connection to reality. And now, hearing it confirmed by the very people at the top, Jada knew, the company was committing fraud. The realization hit her like a slap in the face. It wasn't just bad decisions or harmless bending of the rules. No, this was a deliberate attempt to mislead, to cover up something huge. Something that could destroy the lives of people who had nothing to do with the corruption at the top. Jada's mind swirled with the implications. The employees, the ones who were working so hard just to make ends meet, what would happen to them when the truth came out? The clients who trusted the company's reports, the investors who poured their money into this corporation, how many lives were being affected by these lies? But Jada couldn't just stand there, frozen in fear. The problem was much bigger than her, and yet, here she was, standing at the center of it all. She was the one who knew the truth, the one who had overheard the confession. But what could she possibly do about it? She was just a cleaner, a faceless employee, someone who didn't matter. The doubt gnawed at her. What if she was wrong? What if she had misinterpreted what she overheard? She couldn't afford to make a mistake. But then, another thought flashed through her mind: if she didn't speak up, who would? The executives? They had too much to lose. The other employees? They had no idea what was happening behind closed doors. Jada was the only one who knew. And that thought scared her. Because once you knew something, you couldn't unknow it. And now, she had a choice to make. For the next few days, the nagging feeling refused to leave her. She couldn't get the conversation out of her head, couldn't stop thinking about the consequences of doing nothing. She couldn't go back to pretending that everything was okay when she knew the truth. But what could she do? It was late one afternoon, as Jada was cleaning the break room, that she made a decision. She had seen Mark, one of the executives, sitting alone in the cafeteria, staring at his phone. Mark wasn't one of the worst offenders, he wasn't part of the upper echelon who had a hand in the company's dirty dealings, but he was someone who had always treated Jada with respect, who occasionally asked how she was doing. Maybe, just maybe, he would listen. Jada gathered her courage and walked over to him. Her hands trembled, and her heart raced, but she knew that if she didn't act now, she might never get another chance. "Excuse me, Mark," she said softly, her voice almost trembling. He looked up, surprised to see her standing there, but his expression softened. "Jada," he greeted, smiling slightly. "How's your day going?" "Not bad," she replied, taking a deep breath. "Listen, I need to ask you something. About the numbers. I've seen some things, and I..." Her words faltered as she tried to find the right way to express the gravity of the situation. Mark was looking at her now, his smile fading slightly as he saw the seriousness in her eyes. "Jada, what is it?" he asked, his tone a little more guarded now. "I think the company is hiding something," she said quietly, her heart thudding in her chest. "I think there's something wrong with the way the numbers are being reported." Mark looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, there was only silence between them, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said finally, his voice cautious. "But if you're worried, you should talk to someone higher up." Jada nodded, but she knew that talking to anyone higher up wasn't an option. They were the ones responsible for the fraud. But Mark's response stuck with her. He hadn't outright dismissed her. That was something. As she left the cafeteria, she knew that she had taken the first step. It wasn't much, just a whisper, a quiet inquiry. But it was something. And for the first time in a long while, Jada felt like she wasn't invisible anymore. She had a voice. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough to make a difference. Jada couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing. It wasn't just the restless thoughts that crowded her mind after she handed Mark the note. Something deeper was stirring inside her, a fear, yes, but also a spark of something else. A realization that she might be at the edge of something she wasn't ready for, but could no longer avoid. For days after her meeting with Mark, Jada kept her distance from the other workers, focusing all her energy on her routine. She cleaned the conference rooms, the restrooms, and the floors. She kept her eyes down and tried to ignore the mounting pressure building inside her chest. It was a strange feeling, a tightness in her throat that wouldn't loosen, no matter how much she tried to ignore it. The truth that she had uncovered gnawed at her like an unrelenting itch. The company's lies were so carefully woven, so precise in their execution, that they had fooled almost everyone. But Jada had seen through the cracks, and now she couldn't unsee them. There was no turning back from this. Her first confrontation with Mark, though brief, had planted the seeds of a plan that was slowly beginning to take shape in her mind. Mark had promised to get her access to the documents, to show her the proof of the corruption that had been hidden behind the glossy reports and perfectly crafted spreadsheets. It had been a step forward, but now the waiting had become unbearable. As Jada made her way through the hallways that morning, she found herself scanning the faces of her coworkers. It struck her how ordinary they all seemed, people, just like her, trying to make a living. They had no idea what was happening behind the scenes, no idea that the company they worked for was built on a foundation of deceit. She thought of the employees who had been let go over the years, many without warning or explanation. People who had worked hard for the company, who had given it their all, only to be discarded without a second thought. They deserved to know the truth. They deserved to see justice done. Her mind returned to the night she had overheard the conversation in the boardroom. The realization that Michael Anderson, the CEO, was involved in the fraud was still fresh in her mind. He was untouchable, powerful, someone who could ruin her with a single phone call. But the more Jada thought about it, the more she knew that she couldn't allow him to get away with it. If she did, she would be just as complicit in the lies as the rest of them. She couldn't let that happen. As she entered the break room later that morning, Jada noticed the same group of executives gathered around the coffee machine. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices low and urgent. She moved to the side, pretending to focus on wiping down the counter, but her ears were tuned to their every word. "I don't care what it takes," one of them, Rachel, said sharply. "We can't afford to lose this deal. If we don't find a way to make the numbers work, we're going to have a serious problem on our hands." "Relax," came Michael's voice, smooth and confident. "We've done this before. The investors are too blinded by our profits to see what's really going on. If we just make it through this quarter, we can keep the game going a little longer." Jada's blood ran cold as she listened. The same cold assurance in Michael's voice was the same voice that had promised employees better bonuses, better benefits, all the while hiding the truth of what was happening behind the scenes. The facade was crumbling, but they still believed they could outsmart everyone. "Just make sure the reports stay consistent," Michael continued, his voice filled with authority. "We can't afford any mistakes. If they catch on now, we'll all go down." Jada felt her chest tighten as she wiped the same counter for what seemed like the 100th time. She didn't have all the details yet, but she had enough. These were the people who had ruined lives, and they would continue to do so if no one stopped them. But what could she do? She was just a cleaner, a woman in a room full of powerful people who controlled everything. Her thoughts were interrupted when Mark appeared in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room before landing on her. He gave a slight nod, signaling for her to meet him later. The unspoken message was clear: it was time. The plan was beginning to take shape. Jada had never felt more uncertain in her life. She had never been a risk-taker, never had the luxury of making waves. But now, standing in that sterile, corporate environment, with lies stacking up around her, she realized that she had no choice. This was her moment. She could either let the corruption continue, or she could do something, anything, to stop it. After her shift, Jada made her way to the storage room where she had arranged to meet Mark. Her heart raced with each step, and her thoughts were a whirlwind of fear and resolve. The storage room smelled like cleaning supplies, bleach, disinfectant, and dust. It was a far cry from the sleek offices of the executives, but in that moment, it felt like her only safe space. Mark was already there, his posture stiff with concern. As Jada stepped inside, he closed the door behind her, making sure no one would overhear them. His eyes were shadowed with stress, but he gave her a nod, a silent acknowledgement of what they were about to do. Jada, Mark said, his voice low, I've been looking into it. The numbers, they don't add up. Not just in the reports you mentioned, but across the whole department. I'm not sure what's going on, but it's bigger than I thought. We're talking about millions of dollars being misappropriated. Jada's pulse quickened. She had suspected, but hearing it from Mark, someone who worked in the upper levels of the company, made it all the more real. The fraudulent activities that had been carefully hidden behind layers of paperwork were no longer just whispers. They were a glaring reality. Mark, this is huge, Jada said, her voice shaking slightly. What do we do now? Mark looked around again, his eyes darting nervously. We need to be careful. I've got access to some of the documents, but if we move too quickly, it could backfire. The higher-ups have eyes everywhere, and they'll do whatever it takes to protect their secrets. Jada nodded, her hands trembling. The weight of what she was about to do pressed down on her chest, but she could feel something inside her stirring, something that had been buried under years of silence and fear. This was her moment, and there was no turning back. I'll help you, Jada said, her voice steady now. We need to expose them. Mark smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. I knew you'd say that. We'll need to gather everything we can, emails, reports, anything that links them to the fraud. It's going to be risky, Jada, but we don't have a choice. Jada took a deep breath, feeling the reality of what they were about to do settle in. This wasn't just about exposing one company's fraud. This was about something bigger. It was about standing up against a system that had used her, overlooked her, and now had taken so much from the people who worked there. What's our first step? She asked, her voice firm. We start small, Mark replied. Get the evidence we need, and then we can go public. But it has to be airtight. If we slip up, we won't just lose our jobs. We'll lose everything. Jada nodded again, her mind racing with the enormity of what lay ahead. She had always been the invisible worker, the one who cleaned up after the powerful, the one who stayed in the shadows. But now, she was something more. She was part of something that could change everything. As she left the storage room, Jada felt a strange mixture of fear and excitement. The walls that had surrounded her for so long, the silence that had kept her hidden, were beginning to crumble. And with each step, she could feel herself becoming more than just a cleaner. She was becoming a voice. And the truth, no matter how terrifying, was something that could no longer be silenced. The days after Jada's meeting with Mark felt like a blur. She no longer moved through the office with the same numb routine she had followed for years. Every step, every action, now carried the weight of something much bigger than herself. She was no longer invisible. She had a purpose, and though it terrified her, she couldn't back down now. Jada had always been someone who kept to herself, content with her quiet, unnoticed role in the corporate machine. But now, she found herself watching every interaction, every conversation, searching for clues, for cracks in the facade that would prove the fraud she had already witnessed. It was exhausting, this constant state of hyper-awareness, but Jada knew that there was no going back. She had seen the truth, and now she had to act. Mark had been her only ally, and as they began to gather evidence, they both knew the stakes were growing higher. It wasn't just about exposing the company anymore. It was about ensuring their safety, too. The more they uncovered, the more dangerous it became. The upper management had their eyes on everything, and the deeper Jada and Mark dug, the more it felt like they were walking on a tightrope, one misstep away from losing everything. One afternoon, as Jada finished cleaning the boardroom after yet another round of meetings, she found herself standing outside the CEO's office, the door slightly ajar. She could hear voices inside, voices she recognized, Michael Anderson, the CEO, and a few of his senior executives. I don't care how you do it, just make sure we hit the numbers for this quarter, Michael was saying, his voice hard, unyielding. If we fail now, we're done. Do whatever it takes, but make it happen. Jada's heart pounded in her chest as she listened. The desperation in Michael's voice was palpable. It wasn't just about profits anymore. It was about survival, about keeping the facade intact. But what Jada heard next sent a chill down her spine. "And if anyone starts asking questions," one of the executives asked, his voice low but filled with fear. "Shut them down," Michael replied without hesitation. "Don't let anyone get close to the truth. We have to keep everything under wraps for a little longer. If we don't, we're all going down." Jada felt the blood drain from her face as the weight of their words sank in. They knew what they were doing. They knew the risks, but they were willing to sacrifice anyone, and everyone, to save themselves. She had already seen the cracks in their operations, but this was a confirmation of everything she had feared. The fraud wasn't just about hiding money, it was about destroying anyone who threatened to expose them. Jada stepped back, her hands shaking. She had to get out of there. She couldn't stay in that moment, couldn't let them hear her eavesdropping. But as she hurried down the hall to the restroom, her mind was racing. The company wasn't just a place of business anymore. It was a ticking time bomb, ready to explode, and Jada had the match in her hands. She found Mark later that day, alone in the break room, his face drawn with exhaustion. When he saw her, his eyes lit up, but then quickly fell again. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he remarked, his voice laced with concern. Jada sat down across from him, her mind still spinning with the conversation she had overheard. "They know," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "They know someone's on to them. They're willing to do whatever it takes to keep the fraud hidden." Mark's face hardened as she explained what she had heard. "I knew it would come to this," he muttered, his fists clenching. "They'll stop at nothing to protect themselves. But we can't back down now. We're in too deep, Jada. If we stop now, it's over. We can't let them win." "I'm scared," Jada admitted, her voice trembling. "They have all the power. They can ruin us. They can make us disappear." Mark leaned forward, his eyes burning with resolve. "I know. I'm scared too. But we can't let fear stop us. We have to keep going, keep gathering evidence. We can't be the only ones who know. We need to get this out there, to the public. We need to expose them." Jada nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She knew he was right. She had seen too much to walk away now, but the fear gnawed at her. What would they do to her if they found out? She was just a cleaner. She had nothing to lose, but at the same time, she had everything to lose. As the days passed, Jada and Mark worked tirelessly, gathering emails, reports, and any shred of evidence they could find. Mark had access to the company's internal servers, and Jada knew she could find crucial pieces of the puzzle if she just dug deep enough. They were taking small steps, covering their tracks, making sure they didn't leave behind anything that could lead back to them. But with every document they uncovered, the stakes seemed to rise higher. One evening, as Jada was cleaning the offices after hours, she stumbled across something unexpected. As she was dusting a shelf in one of the private executive offices, she noticed a binder tucked out of sight behind a stack of files. Curious, she opened it, only to find a collection of documents detailing the company's financials, documents that didn't match the public reports at all. The numbers were vastly different, and what caught her eye was a set of transactions that had been marked as confidential, but clearly indicated illegal activities, money laundering, embezzlement, and fraudulent invoicing. Jada's heart raced as she flipped through the pages. This was it. This was the evidence they needed to take down the company. But the realization sent a chill through her. If she took these papers to Mark, they could be one step closer to exposing the truth. But if she kept them, they could be the very thing that would bring her down. She hesitated for a long moment, her hands trembling as she held the papers. Finally, she made her decision. She slipped the binder into her bag, careful to make sure no one saw her. Her heart was pounding as she made her way out of the office, but she knew she had taken a major step forward. She had the smoking gun. Now all they needed was the courage to use it. Later that evening, Mark met her outside the building, his eyes darting nervously around to make sure no one saw them. "What's in the bag?" he asked, his voice low. "I found something," Jada said, her voice shaking. "This is it, Mark. This is the proof. Everything we need to expose them." Mark's eyes widened as she handed him the binder. He flipped through the pages quickly, his face growing darker with each passing second. This is bigger than I thought. We have them." The realization hit Jada all at once. This wasn't just about exposing one company's fraud. This was about something far larger, the systemic corruption that had been allowed to thrive for so long. And now, they had the power to bring it all down. But as Mark closed the binder and looked at her, his expression somber, Jada knew they couldn't afford to be complacent. They had to move quickly. The executives had already made it clear they were willing to do whatever it took to protect their secrets, and now that they knew someone was onto them, they wouldn't hesitate to go after anyone who threatened them. Jada felt a surge of anger rise up within her. They had taken so much from people like her, the workers, the employees who had been fired without reason, the families who had been left struggling. This wasn't just about a corporation. This was about people's lives, and now it was time to make sure that the truth came to light. But as they prepared to take the next step, a sense of dread crept over Jada. She knew that exposing this truth would be dangerous, not just for her, but for everyone involved. But as she looked at Mark, and then down at the evidence in her hand, she knew there was no turning back. They had uncovered the lies, and now it was time for the world to see them. The weight of what they had uncovered felt unbearable, yet it also brought a strange sense of purpose to Jada. It wasn't just about the company anymore, or the fraud. It was about something much bigger, a need for justice that had burned inside her for years but had never found an outlet. Now, with the evidence in her hands, she could no longer stay silent. But as the days passed and the momentum of their efforts grew, Jada felt the crushing weight of what she had set in motion. The fraud wasn't just a small mistake. It was a system of lies, greed, and corruption that had been allowed to thrive under the protection of those in power. And now that Jada and Mark had the proof, there was no turning back. The first step was contacting the authorities. But that, too, came with its own dangers. The last thing Jada wanted was to be swept up in a legal battle that could ruin her life forever. She was just a cleaner. Just a woman who had seen too much, said too little, and now, finally, had the courage to speak the truth. What would happen to her if they retaliated? She had no idea. As she sat in the small, dimly lit room at the back of the community center, her hands trembling as she typed out an anonymous message to the authorities, Jada knew she had crossed a line. She wasn't just exposing a company's wrongdoing. She was exposing herself, too. She had placed herself in the crosshairs of the most powerful people she knew, the very ones who could destroy her with the press of a button. Her phone buzzed, breaking her from her thoughts. It was Mark, his message short but urgent, "They know. Be careful. They're on to us." A cold shiver ran down Jada's spine. She had known the risks, but hearing that the executives had caught wind of their investigation sent a wave of panic through her. Everything they had worked for, everything they had risked, was in danger of falling apart. She had never been good at this, fighting, confronting power, but she had to be now. Jada took a deep breath and forced herself to focus. There was no time for panic. She had to keep moving forward. The truth had to be told. As she pressed the send button on the email, marking the beginning of their official attempt to expose the fraud, Jada felt a strange sense of liberation. For so long, she had been invisible, overlooked. But now, she was part of something bigger than herself. She was part of a fight for justice, for fairness, for people who had been silenced by the powers that be. The days that followed were a blur of emotions, fear, anxiety, and excitement. Jada was constantly looking over her shoulder, certain that someone was watching her, waiting for her to slip up. But she couldn't stop now. She couldn't go back to the woman she had been. She couldn't go back to being invisible. Despite the overwhelming pressure, there was a flicker of hope inside her, a flicker that grew stronger each time she thought about the people she was fighting for. The employees who had been wronged by the company, the families who had been left behind, the people who had been told they didn't matter. Jada mattered. She had a voice, and she wasn't afraid to use it anymore. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure on Jada only grew. She had expected some form of retaliation, but she hadn't anticipated just how far the company would go to protect its secrets. The anonymous threats began shortly after her email was sent, delivered through obscure channels, letters slipped under her door, vague warnings on her voicemail, and ominous messages left in her inbox. At first, the threats seemed like nothing more than idle intimidation. But when the company began to cut her hours and started to slowly phase her out of her usual cleaning duties, Jada realized just how serious things had become. She was no longer invisible. She was now a target. Mark, too, had begun to feel the heat. He had been transferred to a different department, a move that seemed harmless enough on the surface but was clearly designed to isolate him. His colleagues avoided him, treating him like a pariah, and the weight of the situation was taking its toll on him. Jada could hear the strain in his voice whenever they spoke. "They're on to me, Jada," he confessed one afternoon, his voice weary. "I can feel it. Every day I'm watching my back, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But I'm not stopping now. We've come too far." Jada could hear the exhaustion in his words. She had never imagined it would get this far, never imagined that speaking out could lead to such isolation, such fear. But she also knew that they had no choice. The truth had been set in motion, and it couldn't be undone. They were committed now. Despite everything, Jada remained determined. Her fear didn't go away, but it became something she could manage. She started going to the local library in her spare time, reading everything she could about corporate corruption and whistleblowing. She needed to understand the full scope of what she was up against, how others had fought back, how they had navigated the dangers that came with speaking the truth. But it wasn't just about the fight anymore. It wasn't just about taking down the company. Something deeper had started to form in Jada's heart, a need to do more, to help others who had been in her position. She couldn't undo the wrongs done by the company, but she could help ensure that no one else felt as small, as powerless, as she had felt for so many years. And so, the idea of the Voice Community Center was born. The idea was simple, but it felt like a lifeline. Jada realized that the very reason she had kept silent for so long was because she had never felt like her voice mattered. She had never felt like anyone would listen to her, that anyone would care. But now, she knew better. She had a voice, and so did others. And the community center would be a place where those voices could be heard. She started small, reaching out to local activists and organizing a small gathering in a rented space. The first meeting was modest, a few chairs around a table with some pamphlets on corporate accountability and workers' rights. But it felt like a victory, her first step toward creating something that could empower others. The idea began to spread quickly. People who had been affected by corporate corruption, people who had been let down by the system, began to show up. They came from all walks of life. Some were former employees of the company Jada had exposed, others were from different industries, but they all shared one thing in common: they had been silenced. As the weeks passed, Jada's small community center began to grow. More and more people came to share their stories, to learn about their rights, to find ways to speak up against the injustices they had faced. Jada's own role within the center evolved too. She became a mentor, a guide for those who had no idea how to fight back against the systems that had oppressed them. The Voice Community Center was more than just a space for education. It became a symbol of resistance, a place where people found their strength and learned that their voices, no matter how small they felt, had power. One evening, as Jada sat in the center, watching a group of young activists plan their next steps, she felt a sense of fulfillment that she had never known before. She had started this journey with nothing but fear and doubt. But now, as she looked around the room at the faces of those who had come together to fight for what was right, she knew that it had all been worth it. In the end, it wasn't about the company, or the fraud, or the revenge. It was about something far more important, the power of a single voice to create a ripple that could change the world. Jada had found her voice. And now, she was helping others find theirs. The fight for justice was far from over, but as she looked at the people around her, she knew that they were no longer silent. They had spoken up, and they would continue to speak until the truth was heard. Jada had come a long way from the quiet woman who had once pushed mops across corporate floors, unnoticed and unappreciated. Now, she stood at the helm of something much greater, something she had never dared to dream of, a community of people who had been silenced, but were now finding their voices. The Voice Community Center had become a beacon for those who had faced corporate injustice, a place where individuals could come together to learn, share their stories, and fight for what they deserved. The journey had been fraught with obstacles, fear, uncertainty, betrayal, but through it all, Jada had remained resolute. She had faced down the powerful forces that sought to silence her and had come out the other side stronger, more determined than ever. But the work wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The first few months of the community center's existence had been a whirlwind. It started small, just a handful of people who had experienced corporate fraud, wage theft, and mistreatment. Jada had been the one to listen, to offer support, but as more people showed up, something incredible began to happen. The space wasn't just about personal stories, it was about collective action. It became a gathering point for the disillusioned, the disenfranchised, and the oppressed. People who had once felt invisible now had a place to belong. Jada had worked tirelessly to make the center a success. She had partnered with local activists, legal experts, and community organizers to offer workshops, seminars, and counseling services. They provided legal resources to those who had been wronged, teaching them how to protect themselves from exploitation. The center offered more than just a safe haven, it became a launching pad for change. But even as the center grew, so did the challenges. The threats from the company that Jada had exposed never fully stopped. Though their efforts to intimidate her had been ineffective in silencing her, the pressure was still there. The anonymous messages, the veiled threats, Jada was no stranger to them. But she refused to be intimidated. She had too much to lose now, and too much to gain. This was bigger than her. It was about creating a system where people weren't afraid to speak up, where they could stand up for their rights without fear of retribution. Jada could feel the weight of her own transformation. She had gone from being an invisible figure, dismissed by the powerful, to someone who could no longer be ignored. She had sparked something, a fire that was slowly spreading, from one individual to another, from one community to the next. And as the weeks passed, more and more people began to hear about the center. Word of mouth spread, and the movement that had started with a single woman's courage had become a force to be reckoned with. One evening, Jada stood before a crowd at the center. It was a pivotal moment. An event designed to bring together community leaders, former corporate employees, and activists. They had gathered to discuss the future of the center and the broader movement for corporate accountability. Jada felt a rush of emotion as she looked out at the faces before her. These were the people who had been overlooked, who had been told they didn't matter. Now, they were standing beside her, sharing in her vision for a more just world. The room was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Jada stood at the podium, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. But for the first time in years, she felt ready. Ready to speak the truth, to share her story, and to inspire others to rise with her. She cleared her throat and began. "Good evening," she said, her voice steady. "I stand before you today not as a cleaner, not as the invisible worker, but as a woman who refused to remain silent. I stand here today because we are all part of something much bigger than ourselves. This isn't just about one company. This is about a system that has silenced too many people for too long." There was a ripple of agreement in the crowd, and Jada could feel the energy shift. People were listening. Years ago, I was just like you, she continued. I was just a cleaner, cleaning up after the rich and powerful, while they turned a blind eye to the harm they were causing. I was invisible. But one day, I realized something. I wasn't just cleaning floors. I was cleaning up lies. And I couldn't ignore them any longer. Her words resonated deeply with the crowd. She saw nods of recognition, faces lighting up with understanding. They had all been there, they had all been invisible once, but not anymore. I fought back, Jada said, her voice growing stronger, because I believed that one person's voice could make a difference. And I'm here to tell you today, you are that one person. Each and every one of you. Together, we are stronger. Together, we can fight for the justice we deserve. The room erupted in applause, the sound echoing off the walls. It wasn't just applause for Jada, it was applause for the movement, for the community that had come together to make their voices heard. It was a recognition that they were no longer invisible, that they had a place in this world. But Jada knew that the battle wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The company might have fallen, but the systems of oppression that allowed it to thrive were still in place. It was up to the people in that room, and the thousands who would join them, to continue the fight. Jada couldn't do it alone. She had never been meant to do it alone. Her eyes scanned the room as she spoke, and she saw the faces of the people who had already been empowered by the center. There was Maria, a former employee who had been fired unjustly from her job, now standing tall as a community organizer. There was Jamal, a young man who had spent years in and out of low-wage jobs, now training to become a legal advocate for workers' rights. And there was Latasha, a mother of 3 who had been intimidated into silence by her employer, now helping to lead workshops on how to protect yourself in the workplace. Jada's heart swelled with pride. These were the people she had fought for, and now they were fighting for others. The Voice Community Center wasn't just a space, it was a movement, a platform for those who had been silenced, and a catalyst for real change. But even as she felt the pride of seeing the center flourish, Jada knew that the work was far from over. She had started something, but it needed to grow. It needed to spread beyond these walls. It needed to reach people who had never felt seen, who had never had a place to turn. And so, she made a decision. I'm calling on all of you, she said, her voice steady and firm. We are building a network. A network of people who are tired of being silenced, tired of being pushed aside. We are going to expand the Voice Community Center to other cities, to other states, to the entire country. We will create a network of support, of education, and of action. This isn't just about one building. This is about a movement, and it needs all of us. As she spoke those words, Jada felt the weight of what they had accomplished, but also the enormity of what still lay ahead. This was no longer just a fight for herself, or for a few people. This was a fight for the future, for a world where no one would have to remain silent, where no one would be overlooked. The applause that followed her words was deafening, and Jada couldn't help but smile. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen. But more importantly, she knew that the people in that room felt seen, too. As the night drew to a close, Jada stepped outside the center, her heart full. The stars above her seemed to shine brighter, as if in agreement with the resolve that had solidified in her chest. The journey had been long, and the road ahead would be even longer, but she was ready. I've done my part, Jada thought. Now it's time for everyone else to find their voice. And so, the Voice Community Center continued to grow, spreading its message of empowerment and justice to every corner of the nation. Jada's legacy was more than just the center, it was the ripple effect she had created. A ripple that would continue to spread, one voice at a time. But this story isn't just about Jada. It's about all of us. It's about the power of standing up, the courage to speak the truth, and the unshakable belief that one person, one voice, really can make a difference. Call to action. Do you have a voice? Do you feel like you've been silenced by a system that doesn't care about you? The truth is, you're not alone. There are millions of people out there who are fighting for what's right, just like Jada. And now, it's your turn to join the fight. Speak up. Share your story. Stand with those who are fighting for justice. Your voice matters. And together, we can create a future where no one is left unheard. Will you be the one to make a difference? Will you use your voice to change the world?